Hello, welcome to the Language and Power Podcast, Series 4, Episode 4, recording on Monday, the 11th of December, 2023. I am Michael Farrelly, and as always, with me is Tom Bartlett. Hi, Tom.
Hi there, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm all right. You? Good?
Oh, grand.
Yeah. And today's episode, we're talking about a new theme, or a theme that's come back to COP28, food, agriculture and water. We'll specifically be talking about fisheries in that. But first, we've had a question from a listener, Marina. Hi, Marina. Thank you for the question. Posted this question on Patreon, our Patreon page, to which there is a link in the description. Marina asks, or she says this, very interesting points analysed and questions raised. A question for you. Looking at these first few days, would you say that the level of vagueness in the politicians' speeches from higher power countries at this COP sounds similar to or different in any way from the previous ones? So, yeah, great question.
It is a great question, and I think it's one that we've become increasingly aware of. As we do analysis, we see this vagueness cropping up all the time and becomes a bit, repetitive, and so losing its interest and making us question whether these are the sort of speeches and these are the texts we should be looking at in relation to COP28, or what exactly is the purpose of the genre of leader speeches or opening speeches and the televised speeches, as we were talking about towards the end of the last episode. So we're going to sort of build on that theme a bit and talk about vagueness and how going to other documents behind the headline document might tell us more, but also might be questioning, the research agenda for critical discourse analysis in terms of looking at front page documents as opposed to delving deeper in the level of intertextuality and interconnection we'd be doing. So all these interconnected points come up from that question, and I know Michael's been having a look at the previous two COPs to see precisely that question. Is it more or less vague?
Well, precisely this. And it is difficult, when you're doing a podcast and you're kind of picking out particular few texts to look at per episode. But what I did, I had a look at the opening speeches of the person who's designated the president of each of the last three COPs, for which we've done a series for each of those. First one, COP26, Alok Sharma was the president of that. Next one was COP27, Shameh Shukri was the president for that. And this current one, COP28, Al Jaber, is the president for this. So I had a look at their speeches. So of course that's very limited. We're not looking at the political world leaders. We're just looking at the people who are opening and responsible for the COP meetings. And it depends on what you're kind of looking for. But I decided that I would look in and say, well, if the thing that's being talked about a lot since Paris is this 1.5 degree target to do with climate change, and how do we meet that target as a species and as nations and so on, and looking at the level of detail around that. So just looking at Alok Sharma in COP26, he talks about keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. So he says the reports agreed by 195 governments make clear that human activity is unequivocally the cause of global warming, and we know the window to keep 1.5 degrees within reach is closing. That's what he says. So he's got that specific detail, 1.5 degrees. There's nothing in his opening speech, at least, which talks about the major contributors to emissions which need to be cut. So on that level, not a huge degree of detail. They do that later in the conference. I mean, that was one of the outcomes of Glasgow was to agree to phase down coal. But in the opening speech, little detail. Looking at the next meeting, COP27 in Egypt, absolutely no mention from what I can see of either 1.5 or these major emitters. So it's much more, even more vague on that score.
Interesting.
Yeah. This meeting at COP28, Al Jaber as the president is the first one of the three to start talking not just about the causes, although he doesn't necessarily kind of put it in those terms, but he does talk about engaging with oil and gas companies. So that's a level of specificity that we just haven't seen in the previous two. So he says, colleagues, let history reflect the fact that this is the presidency that made a bold choice to proactively engage with oil and gas companies. We had many hard decisions, let me tell you. It wasn't easy, but now many of these companies are committing to zeroing out methane emissions by 2030 for the first time. So in terms of talking about those sectors, industries, corporations, even down to the level of corporations, he's much more specific, less vague on that
Mm.
point. But still, it's relative, isn't it?
It is that, and that's what I'd say. Very interesting because he does mention the oil and gas company, so at least they're on the table, even if
Yeah.
from our discussion of it, we thought, well, this was maybe a response to the fact that
Yeah.
United Arab Emirates have been caught having these negotiations behind the scenes. And there is clearly a reference to unabated coal production. And unabated coal production means when you're not doing the carbon reductions in the process of
Mm.
producing coal. And sort of, therefore, to an extent, gets oil off the agenda by mentioning unabated coal as an alternative. But there are specifics now. And I suppose this is what counts as progress in the talks, is that what you say would not be the same as what counts as progress behind the scenes that maybe lead to these changes. We were talking about these different timescales, weren't we, and how whether the opening speeches were a reflection of work that had gone on in the past or should be measured about setting the agenda for going ahead. And even though maybe this particular opening speech doesn't seem that progressive, what counts as progressive in these rather vague, glossy for television speeches is a really interesting question. And I think you're right, that at least it's getting closer to addressing the issue. And the
Yeah.
1.5 and the phasing out of coal, phasing down of coal, was a huge talking point in Glasgow, and that agreement caused a lot of controversy. So getting it sort of reified and placed on the table is itself an achievement, I suppose.
Yeah. That's the big question again, isn't it? What significance in terms of people who are involved in this kind of international diplomacy, climate diplomacy, I suppose you could call it. How significant is mentioning oil and gas or basic coal in these opening speeches? Does it send ripples? Does it scare people? We don't have access to the
Mm.
effects that it has on those people who are in that practice and fully kind of aware of the subtleties of what's being said by different people. I'm
That's
sure they've
really
put a lot of
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, because we are going to talk about that after Christmas in terms of about climate action awareness and what terrifies or makes people feel optimistic in the public. But of course, that's another question: is how much you want to scare industry away, because these are important actors as well. And if you want a negotiated outcome, then you've got to be careful. It's all a question of realpolitik, isn't it? It's not just idealism, and it's getting your hands dirty. Really interesting questions about how you tread carefully, yet maintain the level of urgency necessary to do so.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's it. I mean, so we'll keep talking about vagueness and specificness as we go on. So thanks again, Marina, for the question. If anybody's interested in also joining the conversation, putting questions to us, you can find you're able to do that on Patreon, to which there's a link in the description. But let's move on to today's topic, which is the theme of food, agriculture, and water, to which they were speaking on the 10th of December at this COP just gone, or still going on as we record. And we're looking at one particular document, and it's called Achieving SDG 2. That's the UN Sustainable Development Goal, and number 2 is to achieve zero hunger. So achieving SDG 2 without breaching the 1.5% threshold, a global roadmap, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So this is, we'll get into some details. We're going to focus on fisheries to just set things in context. I'm going to have a little read of the opening to this document. It's a 42-page document. I'm not going to talk about all of it, but the first part, just to give the significance of it, says in 2022, 738.9 million people faced hunger. 2.4 billion in 2022 were moderately or severely food insecure, and over 3.1 billion lacked access to healthy diets. The pandemic added 120 million to the chronically undernourished. By 2030, an estimated 590.3 million will suffer hunger. Progress towards global nutrition targets is uneven. The planet faces crises exceeding safe limits in 6 of 9 planetary boundaries. majorly tied to agri-food systems. These systems contribute to 30% of anthropogenic GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, impeding climate goals. Despite the Paris Agreement's aims, warming rates suggest a gap in meeting targets. Agri-food systems face a dilemma, producing more now to address immediate needs while endangering future food security and nutrition, or curb production to reduce emissions. So that's how they are introducing this document, and it kind of gives us a little bit of context.
It does, and I was just as you were reading that again, I stopped just at a sentence that really grabs me that maybe we want to come back to, and it's this perceived trade-off has led to inaction and emboldens climate action skeptics, which relates to a point we were making earlier about the fact that when there's any ambivalence about goals, it gives people an excuse to ignore them or to even go against them as soon as they see either from the idealists on the one side who aren't satisfied with the rate of progress, or from the climate change deniers on the other who see this as a sort of proof that it's all blah, blah, blah and not in real world. So sorry, I just that last sentence caught me there,
no,
but I do like
right.
that.
No, you're right. I think that's the important part actually of this, isn't it? You've got to use language which does not give the excuse for inaction, and I guess that's what we're all trying to get to. Yeah. So there's the context. Now this document is the first part of a roadmap that is planned by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So did you want to kind of talk about the what we see as that roadmap at this point, Tom?
Specifically parts of that can connect with my interest here, which is to do with fisheries, but also to do with this ways of talking that keep people on board and keeping multiple partners on board. I mean, as a discourse analyst, rather than, though I have my opinions about climate change and the causes and effects, more specifically, I'm interested in how to, if there's any way as discourse analysts we can contribute to the conversation. As a discourse analyst, I can say that something is good or bad communication rather than say something is good or bad science. And I think that's what I'm particularly interested in terms of consultations with multiple partners, which I think this introduction points to. Interesting as well, this introduction says, despite the Paris Agreement, it's an admission that we're not going fast enough, which is quite interesting. But it puts out a roadmap how to get us back on track.
Well, what a roadmap that spans multiple COPs is what they're kind of suggesting, isn't it? So,
yeah, it's true, isn't it? When the Guardian introduces this document, it says that it introduces 20 key targets to be met between 2025 and 2050, but little detail on how they can be met. But I think that's what we're saying. It offers a lot more detail than any of the big headline speeches that we see. And even this morning, when I was looking at some other texts, I saw some more very vague text from this particular session and thinking, oh my God, not more vagueness and lack of agency. But it is there. But this sort of takes us to as you say, it's the first document. It's supposed to set milestones and get the conversation going in more detail, isn't it? And so it relates to our question about what documents or what interconnections between documents should we be looking at if we want to get a real idea of what's happening in the discourse.
Yeah. What they say in this is that this document comes out, Volume 1, presenting a global vision. At the next COP, it's called Volume 2, moving from a global to a regional view, and from a vision to costing and financing. And then the third stop on this roadmap is Volume 3, establishing country action plans, monitoring and accountability. So to lots of us outside, this seems glacially slow, but there's a lot of people that need to kind of get on board with these things, and they've set out a plan. So if there's a lack of detail, they're at least, whatever lack of detail there is, they're at least projecting that some of those will be addressed over the next couple of COP meetings. So that is interesting. So
it is, and it relates to the very thing at the end of that introduction about the ambivalence in getting people on board and taking action, thinking about whether we feed people immediately and think about the future, or think about the future. And these questions have come with the discussion as well, because if you discuss things too quickly, I know this is a sounds like an excuse for blah, blah, blah. But making poorly informed decisions
Mm.
is not good practice. Things have to slow down, and it reminds me of in academia as well, when some of us who are not big fans of big data, or that's not the be all and end all of everything is big data. And from anthropology we talk about research being small and slow because we think it tells us more. But how do we balance that with the impending crisis and the speed of global warming? And it's again that balance between working quickly in any, when people are having consultations, but making sure it's done effectively. And that's one of the points that comes out of this roadmap, isn't it? We're looking specifically at fisheries and aquaculture, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are 9 points which you can find on pages 13 and 14 of the roadmap that we'll attach along with the podcast details. What I find very interesting in this, and I know you've got more to say about social actors, is on the one hand, it recognizes the need for decisions to be, or policy to be made at multiple levels simultaneously. And one of the things I've been working on is in Scotland, the introduction of highly protected marine areas, which were sort of these restrictions on fishing activities or marine activities within 10% of the coastal waters of Scotland. And they're sort of imposed pretty carelessly without much consultation. And there was a huge backlash, which led to the scrapping of the plan. So this sort of fits in with my idea, what we were just saying there, that doing stuff quickly without consultation is a waste of time if it just blows up in your face. And so what I find interesting about some of the stuff here is that actually there is a recognition, small scale fishing, that fishermen, people working in fishery, there is this right to continue exploiting or local resources, that we can think about onshore and inshore fisheries and sustaining livelihoods. These are all mentioned, which is a great improvement on the blanket ban that was coming out from the highly protected marine areas in Scotland. But at the same time, I think, as you pointed out when we were discussing this earlier, all the decision-making processes are coming from above, and all the action is coming from above. If we look through this and think about who the actors involved are, it's about enabling people to do stuff, but there's not an awful lot of agency on behalf in terms of developing processes from fishermen, people working in fishers, and people working in fisheries, but also the lack of consultation. But if we just go back very briefly, sorry, to the International Labour Organization,
which we discussed in a previous episode. I think
we discussed,
just
yeah.
transitions.
So just to go back on that, when it talks about what makes a just transition, it says sustainable development is only possible with the active engagement of the world of work. Governments, employers, and workers are not passive bystanders, but rather agents of change who are able to develop new ways of working that safeguard the environment, present and future generations.
Yeah.
So the idea is that there's supposed to be this consultation, and this, I think you addressed this when you said that Jabir was, stressing getting the oil companies and the gas companies on board. The ILO suggests we need to get workers on board with our discussions, but yet this document, which is more detailed than a lot of stuff we look at, allows for small scale fishing and for local fishing, but at the same time, there's no mention of collaboration in setting the agenda or developing the agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. What we've got, it gives us 9 points, like 9 action points. And the one that addresses, if we think about this from a discourse analytical perspective, looking at the representation of social actors and thinking about that definition from the International Labour Organization, where are the workers, where are the people who work in this industry? Well, it names them fishers and fish workers. There's also aquaculture as well, but particularly on fisheries. It names them and says that they've got protect fishers and fish workers with social protection and inclusive access, increased capacity and access to social protection, decent working conditions and safety at sea for fishers and fish workers, enhance safety standards for fishing vessels, promote women and youth employment in fisheries, which I wouldn't argue from, I'll argue with. I think all of those things are good. But if we think about the representation of social actors, we can think about whether a particular social actor is seen as being active or passive. And in this case, the fishers are receiving protection from elsewhere, which is probably a good thing. But there's nothing equivalent to the International Labour Organization's call for, what did they say? Just wrote down what you said. Active participation. That's not active. Being agents of change. There's nothing in here about the workers in fisheries being agents of change in this, and they'll have a lot of knowledge. As I'm sure your experience has found that people who work in these industries have a lot of knowledge and are a rich form of a rich resource to kind of think about. Well, how do we do this in a sustainable way?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It does talk about in point 6 here on page 14 says improve effective fisheries management by using innovative data and information systems.
Yeah.
Fantastic. But this is clearly relating to high tech and scientific advances, which is, of course, incredibly important. There's no talk of using that in collaboration with the fishermen themselves, the fish workers themselves, and the fishery workers themselves, and learning from local environmental stuff. It does talk about it. There is an idea of scales, that things are managed at different levels, but it doesn't really involve the people. One of the things I like in terms of agency is this really lovely one that we get on point 3, which says it will facilitate. The aim is to facilitate adoption and implementation of international instruments and guidelines, etc. I love this facilitate adoption and implementation. This is really just saying it's the fishery workers who've got to follow the guideline, but the facilitation is in helping them to follow the guidelines. It's a really sort of, in order to facilitate people to do what we're telling them to do.
Yeah, I think that's just as you're saying that reminds me of how we just started this discussion, thinking about the role of discourse analysts, and we're kind of quickly getting into, well, what's missing here, what details are missing about the vagueness. But I think what we're kind of, I guess the value of a kind of close analysis like this is to say, well, what kinds of questions, as we're looking at this roadmap going over the spring, over the next 3 COPs or the next couple of COPs, what questions need to be addressed by the people who are actually making these documents and making these decisions? And here are a few of them. You've got this industry, which on the one hand you're calling for, protection for people who work in the industry, and at the same time calling for improved management of the resource, the fisheries resource, also improving the governance of that resource, but not kind of connecting those 3 dots together. So what is the point of, what is the role of people who work in the industry in saying, well, this is how you could improve the governance. This is how you could improve the management and the understanding of how the fisheries work. So that, I guess that's what we can say is, well, we can look at these documents and say, here are some clear questions for you people who are doing these negotiations to address in the next iteration of these kind of documents. And it'd be interesting to see if they can do that.
No, that's true.
Isn't there?
It is, in the level of detail, though there might not be much detail and we sort of feel we can't get fully to grips with it. What it's doing is this document is setting out the parameters of what will become more detailed discussion in future documents. It's very important to look at those. There's lots of, this document is only said as sort of medium level for consumption. It is framing the way that future documents will be made, and that more detailed policy and more binding policy will be made in terms of how it sets up these social actors and these questions from the beginning. And if it hasn't raised the question of consultation and transfer of knowledge in these 9 points, then that level of detail is unlikely to be developed, because those aren't the questions that the people have been asked going forward. So even though it's vague, it's still important in thinking, well, what does it permit? What does it allow? Or even what does it, what will act as a catalyst for in terms of future discourses? So it is still worth looking at this document and seeing what's there and what isn't there in the way that different actors are presented and how they will be investigated.
Yeah, yeah. It's, and as we've referenced a couple of times, the International Labour Organization did give a couple of pithy ways of saying this, not going into huge amounts of detail either, but saying active and agents, using those terms in relation to people who work in an industry, it is a way of doing it. You don't have to specify how it's done. But you've worked with people in the fisheries around Scotland, and it's very clear, I think, from that work, that people have a level of knowledge that can be disregarded by people in authority. I don't know if you wanted to tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing question, of course, and it's one thing I keep banging on about is scales and the space and time over which we have knowledge, and the difference between knowing a small area extremely well and knowing a large area fairly well. And both sorts of knowledge are really important, but they should be seen as interdependent. And I think it's become an opposition. And in the talk I gave in the discourses of sustainability thing we do for critical discourse analysis for the Discourse Net, was precisely on that there was an opposition created between the deep local knowledge of inland fishermen, inshore fishermen, and what was characterised as pen pushers and city folk who made the policy. And I think that's an opposition that serves a purpose in particular cases. It was the song that I analyse, and the whole work around that was successful in bringing the highly protected marine areas consultation policy to an end. It hadn't been properly consulted upon, but it didn't draw on the knowledge as it didn't propose a way forward. It was effective to some extent, but there's much more than that to be done. Just stopping a very bad policy is not the same as then helping to contribute to a better policy. And in terms of just transitions and discourse analysis, what I think is very important is the consultation process before legislation is made to make sure everyone's on board and these different parties are consulted properly. But then after that, the degree in which different voices and different scales of activity are involved in that very sustainable practice, once it's implemented, once it's been passed, what's the continuing of local communities, etc., to plan their own activities and to carry out their own activities once legislation's been made. And again, your social actor stuff is really important here in terms of agentivity, beneficiary, passive recipient, and all that sort of stuff going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is important. Let me ask you a question. The opposition between community-based fishing industries, which is the livelihood of fishing villages around the world, versus the kind of factory fishing, is, I guess, in opposition to the kind of small scale that we're talking about? Or how do people think about that?
I would, again, this is talking what's within and without my area of expertise. Okay. But what I could say is that, yes, I mean, because the factory ships, the big ships that mop up fish and can them, the small fishing populations, of course, are opposed to the encroaching on their waters, etc. So there's a hostility towards those. But at the same time, this is where the bulk of fishing, how the bulk of fishing takes place, rather than the small inland fishing. So it's a question of working out what interconnections between small scale and large scale are sustainable, and that leaves the place, small scale fishery, relatively small scale fishery, that is at the heart of communities in certain places. But it's a question I wouldn't like to delve too much into what fishing folk themselves say about this or the science of it. That's not my job or my area of expertise, and I wouldn't like to dabble there. But I'm very interested in making sure that that's a conversation that stays alive.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tom. There are links to all the texts we've spoken about in the episode description. Don't forget that we have a website where you can sign up for email alerts when we have a new episode out. We have a new YouTube channel, also a link in the description, and a Patreon where you can also post questions that we'll attempt to address. So thank you very much. Thank you.